The afternoon sun burned white above the Libyan desert. Heat shimmered across the wrecked armor of the previous night's engagement, bending light into a mirage that made distance impossible to judge. Inside a dusty Crusader III tank, Sergeant Harold Lansdowne wiped sweat from his brow and squinted through the periscope. It was June 1942, outside a place the maps called Knightsbridge Box, west of Tobruk. To the men inside the tank, it might as well have been the end of the world. Rommel's guns had found them again. The Afrika Korps had wheeled north during the dawn, and now their long-barreled 76mm Pak-40 anti-tank guns were cutting great wounds into the British armour line. Every few seconds came that familiar sound, a flat, snapping crack followed half a heartbeat later by the shriek of a round, tearing air, and then the dull thud as another tank disappeared behind a column of sand and smoke. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lansdowne's gunner, Corporal Evans, cursed under his breath. "They've got the range, Sarge." "Keep low, keep buttoned," Lansdowne answered automatically. He didn't bother to look up from the periscope. Out there, beyond the haze, he could see nothing but rippling air and flashes. Each muzzle blast came from a different place. The Germans had dug in their guns, camouflaged them with netting and scrub, and positioned them so each field of fire overlapped the next. The result was a killing ground. A voice crackled through the radio, barely audible beneath static. "B Squadron to all call signs, smoke if you've got it. Withdraw 200 yards east, hull down." Evans looked sideways at his commander. "Smoke? Sir, we're out of shells that matter. Last canister was used this morning." Lansdowne's hand hovered over the turret. Controls. He remembered something that had happened 3 days earlier, when a mechanic from the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, a corporal named Sid Carberry, had mentioned a trick he'd seen used during a training exercise near Mersa Matruh. It sounded idiotic at the time, something that would never work in combat. Yet the words came back to him now. If you can't see them, they can't see you. Smoke's not just a screen, it's a mirror. It had seemed like nonsense then. Now, with the German guns zeroed on his position and his section being torn apart, Lansdowne decided to try what Carberry called the stupid trick. He yelled down to the driver, "Arthur, turn her broadside. Loader, grab those smoke grenades from the rack, all of them. Toss 'em out the side hatch when I tell you." Within seconds, the Crusader's turret slewed 90 degrees. Evans muttered a prayer as the driver throttled up, kicking sand. The loader popped open the side hatch and began throwing smoke grenades into the desert wind. White plumes erupted, drifting low and slow across the flat expanse. To anyone watching from the German line, it must have looked like madness, a tank turning broadside, making itself the biggest possible target, while a thin curtain of smoke crawled uselessly across the ground. But something strange happened. The enemy fire slowed. The first shell came short, the next one wide. A third round passed somewhere above the turret and vanished in a puff of sand 50 yards behind them. Inside the Crusader, the crew felt a tremor of disbelief. Evans laughed a dry, nervous laugh. "They've lost us, sir." Lansdowne leaned close to the periscope again. Through the haze he could see the sun refracting off the smoke like light on water. The trick worked because of the desert itself, the heat, the glare, the constant shimmer that distorted everything. When the smoke mixed with the mirage, the German gunners' rangefinders could no longer distinguish sky from sand. To them, the Crusaders seemed to vanish. That afternoon would later be remembered not for its casualties, though there were many, but for the moment a single tank commander realized that concealment was not only a matter of equipment but of perception. His stupid smoke trick would spread by word of mouth through the British armoured brigades and, within weeks, become an improvised doctrine. Yet, to understand why that moment mattered, why one sergeant's desperate improvisation could alter the rhythm of desert warfare, we must return to the months before it happened, to the mindset of British armoured command and the psychological weight of fighting Rommel's army. In the winter of 1941–42, the Western Desert Campaign had reached a paradoxical phase. The British Eighth Army had numbers, supplies, and a growing fleet of American-built tanks arriving through Egypt's ports. Rommel's forces were exhausted after their long retreat to El Agheila. On paper, the balance favoured Britain, yet morale within British tank units remained brittle. The men called themselves the Desert Rats, but the name often sounded more like grim irony than pride. For months they had been told that superior discipline and technology would prevail. Their commanders had faith in armour the machine as the decisive instrument of war. But every encounter with German guns seemed to contradict that faith. Rommel's 75mm Pak-40 and its earlier cousin, the Pak-38, had become the terror of British tank crews. Capable of penetrating nearly 3 inches of armour at over 1,000 yards, the gun was lighter than the British 6-pounder and could be moved by hand. German doctrine treated anti-tank defence not as a separate support arm but as the spine of the battlefield. Every advance of British armour inevitably ran into hidden gun lines, arranged in what the Germans called pack fronts, mutually supporting fields of fire. By the time Lansdowne's squadron reached the desert, this pattern had repeated itself enough times to feel inevitable. Tanks would advance across open sand, confident in their speed and firepower, until the first gun flashed. Then another, and another. In minutes the desert would be filled with burning wrecks. Survivors would withdraw under smoke cover if they had any, often abandoning disabled comrades because recovery vehicles could not approach under fire. The British crews knew the statistics. During Operation Crusader in late 1941, the Eighth Army had lost more than 700 tanks, twice the German total, even though they technically won the battle. Of those, nearly 60% were destroyed not by tanks but by concealed anti-tank guns. The German gunners could engage at ranges where the 2-pounder guns of the early Crusaders and Valentines could barely scratch their armour. Inside that arithmetic of loss, superstition began to creep. Some tankers painted names of good luck across their hulls. Others refused to wear watches, believing time itself brought bad luck. A few experimented with unorthodox methods, small tactics that could be tried when doctrine failed. Smoke shells were one of those. Officially, British armoured doctrine treated smoke as a tool for artillery, not tanks. Tank crews carried a few smoke rounds in their racks, mostly for signalling. When used in combat, smoke screens were expected to be laid by supporting artillery batteries or specialised units. Yet, by early 1942, frontline crews began using them more freely. In the words of one veteran of the 10th Hussars, "We found the book didn't match the sand." Lansdowne's decision that June Day was therefore both reckless and innovative. His unit, B Squadron of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, had been ordered to hold the flank near Knightsbridge while infantry regrouped. The heat alone was enough to warp gun barrels. Inside the Crusader, temperatures could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew's water ration was 1 quart per man per day, barely enough to drink, let alone wash. Their food was bully beef and hard biscuits that crumbled to dust. Every man knew Rommel's reputation. To them, he was not the caricature of later years, but a real presence, the ghost in the sand who always seemed to strike from the flank. The Germans called him Der Wüstenfuchs, the Desert Fox, a name that British crews repeated with reluctant admiration. But what made Rommel's forces truly lethal was not mystique but method. The German system emphasized initiative at every level. Gun crews were trained to act independently, choosing their targets without waiting for orders. Once they opened fire, they relocated within minutes, preventing counter-battery strikes. British tank commanders, by contrast, operated under tighter control, Radio discipline was strict. Unauthorized maneuvers could bring reprimand. The result was predictable rigidity. When the smoke trick began to spread, it did so quietly, below the level of doctrine. Mechanics and drivers passed the story from unit to unit. Someone heard that a sergeant had survived a pack front by using grenades instead of shells. Others tried it during minor skirmishes. Reports filtered upward through informal letters, home and after-action notes. Visibility lost by enemy after own smoke deployment. One after-action report from July 1942 reads, "Enemy fire ceased for 2 minutes, permitting withdrawal." 2 minutes, a small reprieve in desert warfare, but enough to save lives. To grasp why those 2 minutes mattered, it helps to consider the mechanics of aiming a German anti-tank gun. The Pak-40 relied on optical sights calibrated for clarity. In desert heat, even a slight distortion in the target image could ruin range estimation. When smoke drifted through the sight line, the gunner's world turned into a blur of white and grey. In that instant of uncertainty, trained reflexes faltered. Many gunners chose to hold fire rather than waste precious rounds. Lansdowne's action, though instinctive, revealed a deeper truth. Warfare was not merely about superior machines, but about manipulating human perception under stress. The desert, with its mirage and glare, offered the perfect medium for such deception. In the days that followed the Knightsbridge engagement, surviving crews compared notes. Some swore the smoke also disrupted the Germans' use of their famous Flieger Leitpanzer forward air controllers, who directed Stuka dives. The smoke made it difficult for the aircraft to distinguish friend from foe. Whatever the precise reasons, the effect was clear. Where smoke was used aggressively, losses dropped. Back in Cairo, staff officers of the 8th Army's Armoured Tactics Branch began to take notice. A memorandum dated July 23, 1942, summarized reports. From the front, several armoured units have employed improvised smoke screens during engagements with marked success. Recommend formal trials to determine tactical value. Those trials would later form the basis for a revised doctrine introduced during the Alamein build-up. But at the time, none of that mattered to Sergeant Lansdowne and his crew. They were alive, their Crusader limping but functional, and the myth of Rommel's invincibility had cracked slightly. When night came, they parked among the wrecks, engines ticking as they cooled. The desert smelled of oil and cordite. In the distance, German flares arced upward like falling stars. Evans opened a tin of rations and muttered, "Not bad for a stupid idea." Lansdowne didn't reply. He was thinking of Carberry, the mechanic whose offhand comment had saved their lives. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Rommel's men were digging in for the next attack. The war in North Africa was far from over. Yet, in that small circle of light inside a tank turret, something had shifted the beginning of a new understanding of how to fight in a landscape where seeing and being seen meant life or death. By late summer of 1942, the desert wind began to change both literally and strategically. The British 8th Army, battered by months of defeats, was reorganizing under a new command. General Bernard Montgomery arrived in August to take charge of what many in London quietly feared was a broken force. He found men still haunted by Rommel's legend, and tanks still haunted by Rommel's guns. Montgomery's first priority was psychological. He knew that morale was as decisive as material. When he addressed the troops at Burg el Arab, his message was blunt. "We will stand and fight here. There will be no further retreat." It was a statement of faith, but faith required evidence. Soldiers had to see, feel, and believe that they could survive the desert battlefield, and that belief often hinged on the smallest, most human discoveries like the smoke trick that Sergeant Lansdowne's crew had begun spreading weeks earlier. In Cairo, the Army's Armoured Tactics Branch compiled field reports from dozens of engagements. One analysis, dated August 12th, noted that localized use of smoke grenades by tank commanders during pack engagements appears to delay or confuse enemy ranging. The memo recommended controlled trials at the Armored Fighting Vehicle School in Abbasia. There, instructors recreated desert conditions using old Crusaders and captured German Pak 38 seconds positioned in dugouts. They studied how different types of smoke, white phosphorus, chlorosulfonic acid, and hexachloroethane interacted with heat, haze, and wind. The results surprised even the engineers. Under certain conditions, particularly in crosswinds of 10 to 15 miles per hour, dense white smoke created by phosphorus shells produced what they called a light interference effect. Through the optical sights of a pack gun, the target image broke apart into flickering shapes, impossible to focus. The hotter the air, the worse the distortion. The report concluded, in desert temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, white smoke renders optical range estimation unreliable beyond 300 yards. For crews who had lived under the German gun line, that statement was revelation. The battlefield that had once been a fixed equation of range and angle now had a new variable: uncertainty. Montgomery's staff incorporated these findings into the training programs for the upcoming offensive at El Alamein. Units were instructed to coordinate smoke use, not only during retreats but during advances. The idea was counterintuitive. Instead of hiding after being spotted, tank commanders would deliberately obscure themselves before engaging. It required discipline and timing. When performed correctly, entire armoured regiments could advance under a moving curtain of smoke, invisible until they were already within firing range. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This tactical innovation was not officially credited to any single man. The army, in its bureaucratic way, absorbed individual improvisations into collective doctrine. Yet, among tank crews, word spread of a sergeant near Tobruk who had first turned his tank broadside and survived. His name circulated quietly, part rumour, part folklore. The Germans noticed too. Intelligence summaries from Panzerarmee Afrika mention increased English use of Rauschgranaten during engagements, and field reports complained that enemy tanks exploit sun and smoke to approach unseen. German observers recorded how British armour sometimes seemed to vanish entirely against the horizon, only to reappear at close range. Rommel's staff tried to counter the tactic with new optical filters and adjusted range tables, but these measures had limited effect. The physics of the desert itself, the interplay of heat, light, and dust, favoured the defender of illusion. By September, the Eighth Army had begun to believe in itself again. Supplies from America arrived through the Suez Canal, M3 Grants and the first shipments of M4 Shermans. These tanks, though not invulnerable, offered something the old Crusaders never could: reliability and range. The Sherman's new gyro-stabilized guns allowed them to fire accurately while moving. Coupled with the smoke tactics spreading through the ranks, this combination gave the British crews a psychological edge they had lacked since 1941. In field workshops, mechanics painted improvised markings on the sides of Shermans and Grants, rough white rings indicating the locations of smoke grenade racks or dischargers. Some crews customized their tanks with additional tubes welded to the turrets. The official 6-barrel smoke discharger, the No-19 projector, became a prized accessory. But when supplies ran short, crews improvised with rifle grenades or even small petrol tins filled with phosphorus compounds. There was risk. White phosphorus could ignite spontaneously when exposed to air. More than one tank crew suffered burns from premature discharges. Yet the men accepted the danger. As one trooper wrote in a letter home, "Better a scorched hand than a German shell through the turret." As the Eighth Army prepared for Montgomery's planned offensive, what would become the Second Battle of El Alamein small tactical experiments multiplied. One of these, conducted by the 1st Armoured Division near Alam el Halfa in early September, demonstrated how smoke could alter the rhythm of an entire engagement. The division's after-action report described a feint against a German gun line. 2 troops advanced under smoke to 300 yards, ceased fire for 1 minute, then reopened with "he" at reduced range. Enemy response disorganized. Estimated 5 guns neutralized. The key phrase was "ceased fire for 1 minute." The pause allowed the smoke to thicken and drift, confusing the enemy's sense of distance. When firing resumed, the Germans no longer knew whether they were facing tanks retreating or advancing. At El Alamein itself, this principle reached its zenith. In the opening hours of October 23, 1942, the desert erupted with light. British artillery fired over 900 guns in the largest barrage since the Somme. Amid the chaos, armoured brigades rolled forward behind carefully timed smoke screens. Some of these were laid by artillery, others by tanks themselves. From the German positions, the battlefield appeared as a shifting wall of white. Panzer grenadiers reported that the British tanks seemed to materialize out of the smoke, like ghosts. Sergeant Lansdowne's unit, now re-equipped with Grants, fought on the southern sector near the Ruaisat Ridge. They used the same trick that had saved them months earlier, only now it was codified procedure. The tanks know. 19 dischargers fired 2 rounds in quick succession, the first to mark the wind direction, the second to lay the screen. As the smoke billowed, Lansdowne's driver advanced in short bursts, maintaining engine revolutions steady to avoid overheating. The loader alternated between armour-piercing and high-explosive rounds, ready for close contact. Through the periscope, the desert once again turned to a blur. Only this time, the confusion was mutual. The Germans, expecting a frontal assault, misjudged the direction of attack. The British, shielded by their own smoke, manoeuvred laterally and struck from the flank. In after-action reports, officers credited the success to aggressive use of obscuration. The irony was complete. What began as an act of desperation had evolved into a cornerstone of tactical deception. After El Alamein, as Rommel's army retreated across Libya, the British continued refining the technique. The new Churchill and Sherman tanks received standardized smoke dischargers mounted directly on the turret sides. American crews soon adopted similar devices, recognizing their value in both desert and European environments. But perhaps the deeper legacy of the smoke trick lay not in its technology, but in its psychology. Before its adoption, British tankers tended to see visibility as an advantage. The clearer the view, the better the shot. The desert had punished that assumption. The smoke tactic inverted it, teaching soldiers that invisibility, even partial or fleeting, could be more decisive than armour thickness or gun caliber. Historians later debated whether such small innovations truly affected the outcome of the North African campaign. Strategically, Montgomery's victory at El Alamein owed as much to logistics as to tactics. By the time the battle began, the Eighth Army had numerical superiority in every category, twice as many tanks, 3 times the artillery, and nearly complete control of the skies. Yet, among those who fought, memories of the smoke were inseparable from the feeling of turning the tide. In interviews recorded decades later for the Imperial War Museum, several veterans mentioned the effect. One recalled, "When that smoke went up, you felt like the desert belonged to you for once." Another said simply, "It gave us time to breathe." Sergeant Lansdowne himself survived the campaign. After El Alamein, he was transferred to the 1st Armoured Division for the push into Tunisia. There, he continued using and teaching the same tactic, now formalized as obscuration advance. When asked years later about the origin of the idea, he laughed softly and said, "We were just trying not to die. The rest of it came later." In a broader sense, his remark captures the central irony of the story. Military innovation, especially in the chaos of total war, often begins not in laboratories or staff meetings, but in the cramped interior of a machine, under fire, where survival forces creativity. The British Army, steeped in tradition, had to relearn that truth in the desert. After the war, when armoured warfare moved to colder, greener battlefields, smoke remained integral. The Centurion tank of the late 1940s featured improved smoke launchers. The Chieftain and Challenger that followed carried them as standard equipment. Modern doctrines describing manoeuvre under obscuration trace their lineage directly to those improvised moments in North Africa. And though official records never list his name among the architects of El Alamein, Sergeant Harold Lansdowne's small act of defiance left a faint but enduring imprint on military history, a reminder that sometimes the simplest tricks born from desperation reveal deeper truths about how humans adapt to fear. When historians speak of the Desert War, they often invoke the grand images: Rommel's sweeping flanks, Montgomery's methodical build-up, the endless convoys of supply trucks across the Libyan sands. Yet inside those images live the smaller, human-scale decisions that changed outcomes: the turn of a turret, the toss of a smoke grenade, the moment a man decided to trust instinct over instruction. Lansdowne's smoke screen did more than obscure metal. It obscured certainty itself. In a war of precision optics and mechanical perfection, he reintroduced confusion not as failure, but as strategy. In the desert night, after the guns fell silent, the smoke would linger briefly before the wind carried it away. What remained was not just survival but understanding, that visibility, so prized by soldiers and engineers alike, could also be a trap. To see clearly in war is to be seen. To vanish, even for a moment, is to live to fight again. By the spring of 1943, the sands that had once devoured armies lay quiet. The Afrika Korps was retreating toward the Marith line in southern Tunisia, its vehicles limping, its myth unravelling. For the British Eighth Army, the desert campaign had become both crucible and classroom. The lessons drawn there about flexibility, deception, and the thin line between panic and innovation would follow the men who fought into every theatre of the coming war. Among those lessons, one seemed almost trivial in its simplicity: smoke saves lives. Yet from that truism grew an entire philosophy of armoured warfare that would outlive the desert itself. In Cairo, as headquarters staff began drafting the post-Alamein tactical directives, the first formal reference to offensive smoke manoeuvre appeared. Paragraph 19 of the January 1943 memorandum read, "When facing prepared anti-tank positions, armoured units will employ smoke to deny the enemy accurate observation. The principle of obscuration before exposure is to be practiced at troop and squadron level. Behind the bureaucratic phrasing lay months of debate. Traditionalists in the Royal Armoured Corps feared that excessive smoke would blind one's own gunners and disrupt coordination. Younger officers, most of them veterans of the desert, countered that the confusion it caused the enemy outweighed any internal inconvenience. Trials in Tripolitania settled the argument. In a controlled exercise, 2 squadrons advanced simultaneously across identical terrain, one under clear sight, one behind artificial smoke. The clear unit suffered 38% simulated losses, the obscured unit 14%. The results were irrefutable. Thus began the codification of what soldiers already called Lansdowne's curtain. The name never appeared in print, but among tankers it circulated quietly, part folklore, part tribute. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in July 1943, the smoke doctrine crossed the Mediterranean with them. British and Canadian units used it to mask beach exits under artillery fire, while American tank battalions still acclimating to combined arms coordination adopted it with enthusiasm. Captain John B. Irwin of the U.S. 2nd Armoured Division later wrote in his field notebook, "The Brits taught us to treat smoke as terrain, something you can build, move through, and destroy. Not just cover, but architecture." That idea that smoke could shape battle rather than merely hide it marked a conceptual leap. On the rocky plains of Sicily and in the hills of Italy, commanders began using timed smoke screens to manipulate enemy perception, steering German guns away from real advances. At Salerno, for example, Churchill tanks of the North Irish Horse used coordinated smoke bursts to simulate a flanking maneuver while the actual assault unfolded elsewhere. German observers reported multiple armoured concentrations where none existed. By late 1943, the War Office issued Training Pamphlet No. 62, The Use of Obscuration by Armoured Troops. Its opening line acknowledged the transformation bluntly. Experience has shown that the proper use of smoke is not merely defensive, but may constitute an offensive weapon of equal importance to shell and shot. For men inside the machines, smoke did something beyond the tactical. It changed how they felt the battlefield. In Tunisia and later in Normandy, crews described the strange calm that accompanied the first moments after discharges fired. The outside world disappeared into a white void. Vision, so long the tyrant of desert combat, surrendered to sound and instinct, the thrum of the engine, the metallic rhythm of the gun loader's hands, the clipped voices over intercom. Psychologists attached to the British Army's Directorate of Medical Services noted a drop in reported anticipatory anxiety among tank crews who regularly trained with smoke. The reason was simple: uncertainty no longer belonged solely to the enemy. To hide oneself, even briefly, was to reclaim agency. As one anonymous crewman put it in a post-battle questionnaire, "It's not that you believe the smoke will stop a shell. You believe it gives you the chance to do something about it." This subtle psychological inversion, the shift from helpless target to active deceiver, would become a foundational concept in post-war military psychology. The Royal Army Medical Corps even cited it in a 1945 paper titled Morale Factors in Armoured Combat. Sergeant Harold Lansdowne never saw Europe. After Tunisia, he was reassigned to a training depot near Alexandria, tasked with teaching new crews how to fight under obscuration. There he developed a set of informal rules he called the 4 seconds. First second, fire the smoke. Second, count the wind, watch the drift. Third, move. The enemy's eyes are blind. Fourth, shoot from a place he cannot expect. The maxim spread far beyond his classroom. Years later, tank instructors in Aldershot still recited those lines without remembering their origin. Lansdowne was demobilised in 1946. He returned to Birmingham, worked in a machine shop, married a nurse named Clara, and seldom spoke of the war. When he died in 1972, his obituary mentioned only that he had served in North Africa. The world had moved on, but within the Armoured Corps, his ghost lingered in manuals, in habits, in the reflexive gesture of every commander who reached for the smoke trigger before advancing. The peace that followed did not last long. By the early 1952, with tensions rising between East and West, NATO analysts revisited every lesson from the last war. The British Army's Operational Research Section examined records from El Alamein to Korea, measuring how obscuration affected hit probability in tank duels. Their conclusion: engagements initiated under partial obscuration yield a 22–27% reduction in first-round hit likelihood by the enemy. In the bureaucratic language of deterrence, that statistic became doctrine. New tanks, like the Centurion Mark III and later the Chieftain, were designed with integrated smoke launchers, no longer improvised add-ons, but factory-built systems tied into the fire control computers. Even the Americans, initially skeptical of British tricks, embraced the idea. The M48 pattern, introduced in 1953, carried 4 banks of smoke grenade projectors as standard. At the same time, chemical engineers experimented with new compositions. The goal was persistence, clouds that would linger longer and drift slower than the ephemeral desert plumes. By the late 1960 seconds, titanium tetrachloride and red phosphorus mixtures replaced the older, more dangerous white phosphorus charges. In NATO exercises across Germany, tank units practiced smoke bounding, advancing in alternating leaps under coordinated screens. Observers noted how entire armoured brigades could vanish from aerial reconnaissance for minutes at a time. The idea of invisibility, once born from fear, became institutionalized as strategy. Yet, in the transition from improvisation to doctrine, something human was lost. Manuals spoke of obscuration envelopes and aerosol persistence, but rarely of the terror that had first driven men to invent them. The smoke trick had become sterile, a mathematical tool. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Israeli tank crews fought desperately against Egyptian and Syrian anti-tank missile teams, some rediscovered the visceral meaning of that white screen. Their American-supplied M60s carried the same kind of launchers that had once adorned Crusaders in the desert. Under barrages of Saga missiles, the Israelis fired smoke constantly, maneuvering through the artificial fog like their British predecessors 3 decades earlier. One Israeli commander, interviewed afterward, said, "We could not see them, they could not see us, so we were equal again." His words echoed Lansdowne's century-old truth. Military historians later traced this continuity with fascination. The tactical DNA of North Africa, they argued, persisted through every evolution of armoured warfare, from the dunes of Libya to the plains of Europe, the Golan Heights, even the streets of Basra. By the 1980 seconds, engineers and physicists began studying the optical science behind what desert veterans had only intuited. Laboratories at Farnborough and Aberdeen tested how particle size and temperature gradients refracted infrared and laser beams. They discovered that smoke was not merely visual camouflage but a multispectral barrier capable of scattering radar and thermal imaging. The old intuition that heat and haze could defeat precision proved prescient. With the rise of laser-guided munitions, modern tanks were equipped with automatic soft-kill systems that launched smoke grenades the moment an enemy's laser rangefinder was detected. The principle was identical to Lansdowne's 4 seconds, only the timing had been shortened to milliseconds. Even the language endured. NATO field manuals still used the phrase visual and electro-optical obscuration, a clinical echo of the desert soldier's simpler expression, make smoke, move fast. Every war, no matter how vast, eventually condenses into stories small enough to fit inside the human mind. The Desert Campaign, once a panorama of tanks and nations, survived in memory as a collection of vignettes. Rommel's mapboard, Montgomery's beret, the Crusaders' thin armour, and somewhere in the middle, the nameless crew who learned how to vanish. When oral historians in the 1990 seconds began interviewing surviving veterans, they often found that smoke featured in their recollections less as a weapon and more as a symbol. One old driver said, "When the smoke came down, you felt you could rewrite what was happening." Another compared it to closing your eyes and starting again. Historians, trained to separate fact from metaphor, were initially wary of such language, but over time they recognized that the emotional truth mattered as much as the technical one. The smoke that saved tanks also preserved sanity. It allowed men to believe that chaos could still be shaped by will. By the 21st century, every major battle tank from the British Challenger 2 to the American Abrams and the German Leopard 2 carried banks of smoke grenade launchers integrated with threat sensors. The technology had evolved into digital precision. But the idea remained ancient. Obstruct the enemy's vision, reclaim control of the narrative. Military academies now teach the evolution of deception and obscuration as a case study in adaptive warfare. Slide 1 shows Rommel's Pack 40. Slide 2, a Crusader disappearing in heat haze. Slide 3, a modern tank ejecting a billowing grey cloud triggered by computer. The instructor's voice inevitably softens when describing the origin. It began with a sergeant who refused to die by the book. At its core, the story of smoke is the story of fear mastered. Warfare in the industrial age had elevated visibility maps, optics, reconnaissance to the level of obsession. To see was to know was to dominate. Yet the desert taught a humbler lesson. Perfect vision can be a liability. Philosophers of war later drew parallels between the fog of war as a metaphor and the literal fog soldiers created to survive. Clausewitz had used the phrase abstractly. The men of the Eighth Army made it tangible. In modern counterinsurgency conflicts, commanders still invoke the concept. Urban smoke screens in Fallujah, infrared blocking aerosols in Donbass, each a descendant of that first cloud over Tobruk. The psychological calculus remains unchanged. When you control what the enemy can see, you control his decisions. Among the papers found in the Imperial War Museum's archives is a faded carbon copy of a letter dated August 1942, written by Sergeant Lansdowne to a fellow mechanic, Sid Carberry, the man whose offhand remark had sparked the idea months before. The letter was never posted. It remained in a file marked Unsent Correspondence. It reads in part, "You said once the smoke was a mirror. I think you were right." The Jerrys looked into it and saw themselves. For a while they stopped being gods with guns and became men again, guessing like us. Maybe that's all we can hope for in this place, to make them guess. No document captures the essence more perfectly. In those few lines lies the entire philosophy of modern deception. To make the enemy guess is to reclaim humanity. Today, the old battlefields of North Africa lie silent. The wind still moves over them, carrying fine dust that once clung to tank tracks and uniforms. Occasionally, travellers stumble upon rusted shells or fragments of armour half buried in sand. Under the right light, the horizon still shimmers the same mirage that once turned smoke into salvation. Standing there, one can imagine the moment before a battle. A tank turning broadside, a hatch opening, a handful of grenades rolling into the heat, then the cloud rising white, blinding, alive. In that instant, the machinery of war becomes something almost human, an act of fear, courage, and imagination bound together. The line between art and survival disappears. The desert becomes a stage where men paint their own existence with smoke. History often privileges the inventors of machines, the engineers, the generals, the planners, yet the story of the smokescreen reminds us that progress sometimes begins in the smallest, most desperate gestures. Sergeant Lansdowne did not design a new weapon, he merely changed how others saw the old one. His legacy endures not in museums but in doctrine, in every armoured crew who reaches instinctively for the smoke button when threatened, and in every commander who understands that confusion can be mercy disguised. The modern battlefield, bristling with sensors and satellites, might seem a world apart from the North African desert. But the principle remains unchanged. Even amid digital clarity, the wisest warriors still value the power to disappear. For as long as men fight, the art of survival will include the art of becoming unseen, and somewhere in that eternal cloud of dust and fire, the faint silhouette of a Crusader tank will turn broadside once more, proving that sometimes the greatest weapon is not the shell you fire but the moment you vanish. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.